The summer heat shimmered off the asphalt as Kiara Johnson drove her modest silver sedan through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Georgia. The digital clock on her dashboard read 2:47 p.m., and she was running slightly behind schedule for her appointment at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Her fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel as she navigated the familiar route, her mind already focused on the meeting ahead. Kiara had always been methodical, precise in everything she did. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in rooms where she was often the only person who looked like her. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, professional but not flashy. She preferred to let her work speak for itself. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, and Kiara slowed to a stop, her hands resting calmly on the wheel. She glanced at her phone, checking the time once more. The appointment was important, not just for her career, but for the thousands of people who would benefit from the new identification policies she had spent months developing. Behind her, the unmistakable flash of blue and red lights suddenly filled her rearview mirror. Kiara's brow furrowed slightly as she watched a police cruiser pull up behind her. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any lights, and her registration was current. Her hands remained steady on the wheel as she waited for the officer to approach. Detective Luke Stevens stepped out of the patrol car, his bulk casting a long shadow across the pavement. At 42, he had the weathered look of someone who had spent 2 decades on the force, his face lined with a permanent scowl that suggested he found very little joy in his work. His partner, Officer Brian Hayes, emerged from the passenger side, younger but no less intimidating in his crisp uniform and mirrored sunglasses. Stevens adjusted his belt as he walked toward Kiara's car, his movements deliberate and theatrical. He had perfected this routine over the years, the slow approach designed to intimidate. Hayes flanked him, positioning himself near the passenger side of Kiara's vehicle, a standard tactical formation that most people found unsettling. Kiara rolled down her window as Stevens approached, her expression neutral but alert. She had been through situations like this before, knew the importance of remaining calm and compliant while maintaining her dignity. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel, a precaution she had learned was necessary in interactions with law enforcement. "Afternoon, ma'am," Stevens said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. He leaned down slightly, peering into her car with undisguised suspicion. "License and registration." "Certainly, officer," Kiara replied evenly, her voice calm and professional. "May I ask why you stopped me? I was observing the speed limit and following all traffic laws." Stevens's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening at what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. "Just get your documents, ma'am. Questions later." Kiara reached for her purse, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. She retrieved her wallet and pulled out her driver's license, then reached for the glove compartment to get her registration and insurance information. Every movement was calculated, measured, the result of countless conversations with friends and family about how to survive encounters with police. "Here you are," she said, handing the documents through the window. Stevens took them with barely a glance, his attention focused more on studying her face than examining her identification. Hayes had been walking around the car, ostensibly checking for violations, but actually looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. "Vehicle looks suspicious," he called out to his partner, though there was nothing remarkable about Kiara's sedan beyond its cleanliness and good maintenance. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Stevens announced, his hand moving to rest on his service weapon in a gesture that was meant to be intimidating. Kiara's heart rate elevated slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I've provided my documentation. Could you please tell me what law I've violated?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Stevens replied, his tone darkening. "Step out of the car, now." Kiara complied, opening her door slowly and stepping onto the sidewalk. She was tall and composed, her posture straight despite the circumstances. She folded her hands in front of her, maintaining eye contact with Stevens while remaining non-threatening in her demeanor. Hayes joined his partner, the two officers now flanking Kiara as Stevens examined her driver's license with exaggerated scrutiny. He held it up to the light, then looked back at her face, then at the license again, shaking his head slowly. "This doesn't look right," Stevens announced, loud enough for passers-by to hear. Several people on the sidewalk had stopped to watch the interaction, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and concern. "I'm sorry," Kiara asked, genuine confusion creeping into her voice. "What doesn't look right?" "This license," Stevens said, waving it in the air. "Looks fake to me. Real poor quality forgery, actually." Hayes nodded in agreement, though he hadn't examined the document himself. "Yeah, we see a lot of these. People think they can just make their own IDs now." Kiara felt a surge of disbelief mixed with anger, but she kept her voice level. "Officer, I can assure you that license is genuine. It was issued by the Georgia Department of Driver Services just last month when I renewed it." "Is that so?" Stevens said with a smirk. "Well, ma'am, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I know a fake ID when I see one. This here is definitely a fake." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Kiara looked between the two officers, recognizing the dangerous territory she had entered. She knew that arguing further could escalate the situation, but she also knew that accepting their false accusation could lead to far worse consequences. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but I must insist that my identification is genuine. Perhaps we could resolve this by having you run the license number through your system?" Stevens laughed, a harsh sound that contained no humor. "Oh, we'll be running it all right. But I'm betting when we do, we're going to find out this belongs to someone else entirely. Identity theft is a serious crime, ma'am." Hayes had moved to the patrol car and was speaking into his radio, requesting backup. The situation was escalating quickly, drawing more attention from pedestrians and passing motorists. Someone had started recording with their phone, capturing the interaction from across the street. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for possession of fraudulent identification," Stevens announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Kiara said, her composure finally showing cracks. "This is a mistake. My identification is real. I work for the state government. I can verify my identity." "Sure you do," Hayes said with obvious skepticism. "And I'm the governor. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Kiara's mind raced as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking around her wrists. She thought about her meeting at the DMV, about the months of work that had led to this moment, about the policies that bore her signature and would revolutionize how the state handled identification verification. The irony was not lost on her. Here she was, being arrested for allegedly carrying fake identification, when she was literally the person who had designed the new security features that made Georgia driver's licenses virtually impossible to counterfeit. "This is Dr. Kiara Johnson," she said as Stevens led her toward the patrol car. "I'm the senior policy advisor for the Georgia Department of Driver Services. I wrote the identification verification protocols for this state." Stevens paused, looking back at her with a mixture of surprise and continued skepticism. "Right. And I'm the president. Get in the car." As the patrol car door slammed shut behind her, Kiara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and complicated ordeal. But she also knew something that Stevens and Hayes didn't. She had resources, connections, and most importantly, the truth on her side. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the growing crowd of onlookers and the person still recording everything on their phone. That video would soon find its way to social media, where it would begin to take on a life of its own. In the back seat, Kiara remained silent, her lawyer's mind already working through the steps she would need to take to resolve this situation. She thought about her colleagues at the Department of Driver Services, about the governor who had personally appointed her to her position, and about the state attorney general who had praised her work on identification security just weeks earlier. Stevens and Hayes chatted casually in the front seat, clearly pleased with what they saw as a successful arrest. They had no idea they had just made what would become the biggest mistake of their careers. The Millbrook Police Department was a modest building that had seen better days, its beige exterior showing the wear of decades of Georgia weather. As the patrol car pulled into the parking lot, Kiara observed the building through the window, noting the faded paint and cracked concrete steps leading to the main entrance. Stevens parked near the rear entrance used for processing arrestees, and he and Hayes took their time gathering their equipment before opening Kiara's door. The late afternoon sun was brutal, the heat radiating off the asphalt in visible waves. "Out you come," Stevens said, his tone suggesting he was enjoying this process far more than was appropriate. "Watch your head." Kiara stepped out of the car with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed, her hands still cuffed behind her back. The metal had already begun to chafe against her wrists, but she refused to show any discomfort. She had learned long ago that showing weakness in situations like this only invited more abuse. The booking area was a stark, institutional space with fluorescent lighting that cast an unflattering glare over everything. The walls were painted an institutional green that had probably been chosen more for its ability to hide stains than for any aesthetic consideration. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with something less pleasant that Kiara didn't care to identify. Officer Emma Clark was working the booking desk, a woman in her late 30s who had been with the department for 8 years. She looked up as Stevens and Hayes entered with their prisoner, her expression showing mild curiosity rather than the enthusiasm her colleagues seemed to feel. "What do we have here?" Clark asked, her tone professional but not unkind. "Fake ID," Stevens announced proudly, as if he had just solved a major crime. "Real amateur job, too. This one was trying to pass herself off as some kind of government worker." Clark's eyebrows rose slightly as she looked at Kiara, taking in her professional attire and composed demeanor. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't put her finger on what exactly was bothering her. "Let's get her processed," Hayes said, consulting his watch. "I want to get this paperwork done before shift change." Kiara was led to a metal chair in front of the booking desk where Clark began the routine process of documenting the arrest. "Name?" she asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "Dr. Kiara Johnson," Kiara replied clearly, making sure to enunciate each syllable. Stevens rolled his eyes. "She's sticking to her story about being some kind of doctor and working for the state. Claims she wrote the ID policies." Clark paused in her typing, looking more closely at Kiara. There was something about the woman's bearing, her calm confidence even in these circumstances, that suggested she was telling the truth. Clark had processed hundreds of arrestees over the years, and most people accused of identity fraud didn't maintain this kind of composure. "Address?" Clark continued, though her tone had become more respectful. Kiara provided her Atlanta address, a upscale neighborhood that raised Clark's eyebrows further. This didn't fit the profile of someone who would be carrying fake identification. "Occupation? Senior Policy Advisor for the Georgia Department of Driver Services," Kiara said clearly, meeting Clark's gaze directly. Stevens laughed harshly. "She's got quite an imagination, I'll give her that." But Clark was no longer laughing. She had been with the department long enough to develop good instincts about people, and everything about this arrest was setting off alarm bells in her head. She had seen her share of identity thieves and document forgers, and this woman didn't match any of the patterns she was familiar with. The fingerprinting process was routine, though Kiara noted how carefully Clark handled the procedure compared to the rough treatment she had received from Stevens and Hayes. When they moved on to the photograph, Kiara maintained her dignity, looking directly into the camera with her shoulders straight. "Any medical conditions or medications?" Clark asked as part of the standard booking questions. "No current medical conditions, no medications," Kiara replied. "Have you been arrested before?" "No, I have not." Stevens scoffed from where he was leaning against the wall. "First time for everything, I guess." Clark shot him a warning look, then continued with her questions. As she worked through the booking process, she found herself increasingly convinced that they had made a serious mistake. Everything about Kiara Johnson suggested she was exactly who she claimed to be. "The license," Clark said finally, turning to Stevens. "Let me see it." Stevens handed over the driver's license with obvious reluctance. Clark examined it carefully, holding it up to the light and studying the security features. What she saw made her stomach sink. The license was genuine. Not only was it genuine, but it contained some of the most advanced security features Clark had ever seen. The holographic elements were flawless, the microprinting was crisp, and the digital photograph was seamlessly integrated into the card's design. "Stevens," Clark said quietly, "this license looks real to me." "It's fake," Stevens insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I know fake IDs when I see them." Clark continued examining the license, noting details that Stevens had clearly missed. The cardstock felt right, the lamination was perfect, and most telling of all, the information matched what Kiara had provided during booking. "I'm running the license number," Clark announced, turning to her computer terminal. "Waste of time," Hayes muttered, but he moved closer to see the screen anyway. Clark typed in the license number and waited for the system to respond. When the information appeared on her screen, her face went pale. According to the Georgia Department of Driver Services database, license number G47895523 belonged to Dr. Kiara Johnson, Senior Policy Advisor for the department. The photograph in the system matched the woman sitting in the booking area perfectly. The address matched. The physical description matched. Everything matched. "Stevens," Clark said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "you need to see this." Stevens walked over to the computer screen, his swagger noticeably diminished. When he saw the information displayed there, his face began to redden. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The system must be wrong." "The system isn't wrong," Clark replied sharply. "Her license is genuine. Everything she told us checks out." Hayes joined them at the computer, reading over Clark's shoulder. The color drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of their mistake. "Maybe she's using someone else's identity," Stevens said desperately, grasping for any explanation that would justify their actions. Clark pulled up additional information, cross-referencing Kiara's social security number, employment records, and educational background. Every piece of information confirmed what she had suspected. They had arrested exactly who she claimed to be. "She is who she says she is," Clark said, her voice heavy with the implications. "Dr. Kiara Johnson, Senior Policy Advisor for the Georgia Department of Driver Services. She has a doctorate in public administration from Emory University, and she's been with the state for 6 years. The booking area fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Stevens and Hayes exchanged glances, both recognizing that they were in serious trouble. "We need to call the captain," Clark said, reaching for her phone. "Wait," Stevens said quickly. "Let's not be hasty here. Maybe we can work this out quietly." Clark stared at him in disbelief. "Work it out? You arrested a senior state official based on a fake ID charge when her identification was completely legitimate. There's nothing to work out." Kiara had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction, though she kept her expression neutral. She knew that every moment of this conversation was digging Stevens and Hayes deeper into the hole they had created for themselves. "Officer Clark," Kiara said quietly, "I appreciate your professionalism in this matter. However, I think it would be appropriate for me to make a phone call at this point." Clark nodded quickly. "Of course, Dr. Johnson. You're absolutely entitled to your phone call." Stevens looked like he wanted to object, but he knew he was in no position to deny anything at this point. Hayes had gone completely silent, apparently realizing that speaking might only make their situation worse. As Clark prepared to escort Kiara to the phone, the booking area door opened and Captain Robert Miller entered. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his career trying to maintain order in an increasingly chaotic world. "What's all the commotion back here?" Miller asked, his eyes taking in the scene. Kiara still in handcuffs, looking composed despite her circumstances, and his officers looking like they had just seen a ghost. "Captain," Clark began, "we have a situation." Captain Robert Miller had been dreading moments like this for the past several months. The political climate was tense, public scrutiny of law enforcement was at an all-time high, and his department was still recovering from a series of incidents that had damaged their reputation in the community. The last thing he needed was another controversy. Miller's office was cramped and cluttered, filled with stacks of reports, commendations, and the accumulated debris of 25 years in law enforcement. The walls were covered with photographs from his career, citations from the community, and a large American flag that had been presented to him by a veterans organization. "Sit down, gentlemen," Miller said as Stevens and Hayes filed into his office. His tone was calm, but both officers recognized the warning signs of their captain's barely controlled anger. Clark had briefed him on the situation, and Miller was still processing the full implications of what his officers had done. Stevens took a seat across from Miller's desk. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Hayes sat beside him, looking like he wished he could disappear into the worn upholstery of the chair. "So," Miller began, his voice deliberately controlled, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. You stopped Dr. Johnson for what reason exactly?" Stevens cleared his throat nervously. "She was driving suspiciously, Captain. Slow, careful, like someone who was nervous about being pulled over." Miller's eyebrows rose. "Driving carefully is now grounds for a traffic stop?" "Well, no, sir, but we had a hunch that something wasn't right, and when we saw her license, it looked fake." "It looked fake," Miller repeated, his tone flat. "Officer Clark tells me that when she examined the same license, it appeared to be genuine. In fact, it appears to contain some of the most advanced security features our state has ever implemented." Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We've seen a lot of fake IDs, Captain. Sometimes the good ones can fool people who aren't trained to spot them." Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Officer Hayes, according to her employment record, Dr. Johnson is the person who designed those security features. She literally wrote the manual on detecting fraudulent identification in this state." The silence that followed was deafening. Stevens and Hayes both stared at their hands, unable to meet their captain's gaze. "Furthermore," Miller continued, "I've just received a phone call from the governor's office. Apparently, Dr. Johnson was supposed to be in a meeting this afternoon with the Department of Motor Vehicles to present new policies that could revolutionize how we handle identification verification. The governor's chief of staff wants to know why one of his top policy advisors is sitting in our holding cell." Stevens' face had gone pale. "The governor's office called?" "Oh, it gets better," Miller said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I also heard from the state attorney general, who wanted to know why we're harassing the woman who just helped his office convict 3 major identity theft rings. Apparently, her work has been instrumental in several high-profile prosecutions." Hayes looked like he was going to be sick. "Captain, we made an honest mistake. We thought we were doing our job." "Your job," Miller said, his voice rising slightly, "is to serve and protect the citizens of this community, not to arrest prominent state officials based on racial profiling and incompetence." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Both officers started to object, but Miller held up his hand to silence them. "Don't even try to deny it," he said. "I've looked at both of your arrest records over the past 2 years. There's a disturbing pattern here, gentlemen, a pattern that's about to come under very close scrutiny from some very powerful people." Meanwhile, in the holding area, Kiara was using her allotted phone call to contact her supervisor at the Department of Driver Services. Director Helen Washington was a woman who had climbed the ranks of state government through intelligence, hard work, and an absolute refusal to tolerate injustice in any form. "Kiara?" Washington's voice came through the phone with obvious concern. "I've been trying to reach you. You missed your meeting at the DMV, and that's not like you." "Helen, I'm calling from the Millbrook Police Department. I've been arrested." The silence on the other end of the line was brief but loaded with implications. When Washington spoke again, her voice was sharp with anger. "Arrested? For what?" "Allegedly carrying fraudulent identification. Kiara said, her voice carrying just a hint of irony. They claim my driver's license is fake. Washington's response was immediate and explosive. They what? The license you just renewed using our new security protocols? The license that you personally oversaw the design of? The very same, Kiara confirmed. I'll be right there, Washington said. Don't say another word to anyone until I arrive. Helen, you might want to call the Attorney General's office as well, and possibly the governor. This is bigger than just a mistaken arrest. Washington paused, understanding the implications. Kiara, are you saying this was deliberate? I'm saying that 2 white officers stopped me for no apparent reason, immediately declared my identification fraudulent without proper examination, and arrested me despite my attempts to explain who I was. Draw your own conclusions. I'll make some calls, Washington said grimly. Sit tight. Back in Miller's office, the captain was explaining to Stevens and Hayes exactly how much trouble they were in. The media is already picking this up, Miller said, consulting his computer screen. Someone recorded the arrest on their phone, and it's starting to go viral on social media. The headline is, "Racist Cops Arrest State Official for Carrying Real ID." Stevens winced visibly. Captain, can we do some damage control here? Maybe release her quietly and hope this blows over? Miller stared at him in disbelief. Damage control? Officer Stevens, you've arrested one of the most respected policy experts in state government. The damage is already done, and it's about to get much worse. There was a knock on Miller's door, and Clark entered with a grim expression. Captain, there are several cars pulling into the parking lot. Government plates. And there's a news van from Channel 7. Miller closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. He had been hoping they might have a few hours to figure out how to handle this situation, but apparently the cavalry had already arrived. Who's here? He asked. I recognize Director Washington from the Department of Driver Services, Clark reported. There are also several people I don't recognize, but they look like lawyers. And the news van is setting up their equipment. Miller stood up from his desk, straightening his uniform shirt. Gentlemen, I want you both to understand something. The next few hours are going to determine whether you have careers in law enforcement or whether you're looking for new jobs. I suggest you think very carefully about everything you say and do. Stevens and Hayes exchanged glances, both recognizing that their world was about to change dramatically. Captain, Stevens said desperately, what do you want us to do? Miller looked at them with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. Right now, I want you both to go home and contact your union representatives. Don't talk to the media, don't talk to anyone from the state government, and don't even think about leaving town. You're both suspended pending a full investigation. As Stevens and Hayes filed out of his office, looking like condemned men walking to their execution, Miller prepared himself for what was going to be one of the most difficult conversations of his career. Director Washington was already waiting in the lobby when Miller emerged from his office. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding authority. Behind her stood 2 men in expensive suits who could only be attorneys. Captain Miller, Washington said, her voice ice-cold with controlled fury, I believe you have one of my people in custody. Miller nodded, extending his hand in greeting. Director Washington, I'm very sorry about this situation. We're working to resolve it as quickly as possible. Washington ignored his outstretched hand. Captain, Dr. Johnson is not just one of my people. She's the senior policy advisor who designed the identification security systems that your officers apparently cannot recognize. She's scheduled to brief the governor tomorrow on policies that will save this state millions of dollars and prevent thousands of cases of identity theft. One of the attorneys stepped forward. I'm Thomas Bradley from the Attorney General's office. We need to see Dr. Johnson immediately, and we need a full explanation of how this arrest occurred. Miller felt the walls closing in around him. This was exactly the kind of situation that ended careers and destroyed departments. Of course. Right this way. As they walked toward the holding area, Washington continued her verbal assault. Captain, I want you to understand that Dr. Johnson holds a top-secret security clearance. She has access to some of the most sensitive information in state government. The fact that she's been treated like a common criminal is not only an embarrassment, it's a potential security issue. Miller winced. Every word Washington spoke was making this situation worse, and he knew that everything she was saying would likely end up in a report that would be read by some very powerful people. Director, I assure you that Dr. Johnson has been treated with respect since she arrived here. Officer Clark has been handling her case professionally. Officer Clark wasn't the one who arrested her, the second attorney pointed out. We're going to want to interview the arresting officers as well. They've been suspended pending investigation, Miller replied quickly, hoping this might earn him some points for taking decisive action. Good, Washington said curtly. That's a start. As they approached the holding area, Miller could see Kiara sitting calmly on the bench in her cell, looking completely unruffled by her circumstances. She looked up as they approached, and Miller was struck by the intelligence and composure in her eyes. Dr. Johnson, Washington said, are you all right? I'm fine, Helen, Kiara replied, standing up gracefully. Though I do think we need to have a serious conversation about training protocols for local law enforcement. The understatement was delivered with such dry humor that even the attorneys smiled slightly. Miller, however, was not amused. He was beginning to realize that Dr. Johnson was not going to be a victim in this situation. She was going to be a force to be reckoned with. The next 24 hours transformed what had started as a routine arrest into a statewide scandal. The video of Kiara's arrest, now viewed over 2 million times, had sparked outrage across Georgia and beyond. News crews from Atlanta, Savannah, and even national networks had descended on Millbrook like locusts, turning the quiet town into a media circus. Kiara sat in her apartment in Atlanta, having been released the previous evening with all charges dropped and a formal apology from the Millbrook Police Department. She was reviewing the morning news coverage on her laptop while sipping coffee from her favorite mug, a gift from her team that read, "World's Greatest Policy Nerd." The story had evolved beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. Investigative reporters had begun digging into Stevens and Hayes' arrest records, and what they found painted a disturbing picture of systematic discrimination. Over the past 3 years, the two officers had made 47 arrests for fraudulent identification, and 43 of those arrests involved people of color. Even more damning was the discovery that 28 of those cases had been dismissed when the fraudulent documents were verified as genuine. The pattern was so clear and consistent that it could not possibly be explained by honest mistakes or poor training. Kiara's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter, the 15th she had received since sunrise. She let it go to voicemail, just like the others. Director Washington had advised her to let the Department of Driver Services handle all media inquiries for now, and Kiara was happy to comply. She preferred to work behind the scenes anyway. At the Millbrook Police Department, Captain Miller was facing the worst crisis of his career. The parking lot was filled with news vans, and protesters had begun gathering outside the building carrying signs that read, "Justice for Dr. Johnson" and "End Police Racism." Miller hadn't slept in 36 hours, and it showed. His office was packed with people he would have preferred never to meet. Representatives from the State Bureau of Investigation, attorneys from the Attorney General's office, officials from the governor's office, and civil rights lawyers who smelled blood in the water. "Captain Miller," said Agent David Harrison from the SBI, a tall man with the precise bearing of a federal investigator, "we've completed our preliminary review of Stevens and Hayes' arrest records. What we've found is deeply troubling." Miller nodded wearily. He had seen the same reports, and they made for ugly reading. "I understand there are patterns." "Patterns?" said attorney Linda Freeman from the ACLU, who had driven down from Atlanta specifically for this meeting. "Captain, this isn't a pattern, it's a systematic campaign of racial harassment disguised as law enforcement." Harrison consulted his notes. "In the past 3 years, Officers Stevens and Hayes have disproportionately targeted minority drivers in traffic stops. Their rate of searching vehicles driven by African Americans is 4 times higher than their rate for white drivers. And their accuracy rate in identifying fraudulent documents is so poor it suggests either criminal incompetence or deliberate misconduct. Miller felt his career slipping away with every word. "What are you recommending?" "Full criminal investigation," Harrison replied without hesitation. "Civil rights violations, abuse of authority, falsifying police reports, and that's just the beginning." Meanwhile, across town in a modest ranch house, Stevens was pacing in his kitchen while his wife attempted to prepare breakfast. The morning news was playing on the small television mounted under the cabinet, and Stevens's face appeared on screen as the anchor discussed the growing scandal. "Turn that off," Stevens growled, but his wife ignored him. She wanted to hear what was being said about her husband. "The officers involved, Detective Luke Stevens and Officer Brian Hayes, have been suspended pending investigation. Sources within the department suggest that this incident may be part of a larger pattern of discriminatory enforcement." Stevens's wife turned to look at him, her face pale with worry. "Luke, tell me this isn't as bad as it sounds." Stevens couldn't meet her eyes. He had been telling himself that this would all blow over, that the department would back him up, that somehow this would all be forgotten. But watching the news coverage, seeing the protesters on television, he was beginning to realize that his life had fundamentally changed. "It's just politics," he said weakly. "They're making a big deal out of nothing." His wife's expression hardened. "Nothing? Luke, they're saying you've been targeting people because of their race. They're talking about federal investigations and civil rights violations." Before Stevens could respond, his doorbell rang. Through the window, he could see 2 men in dark suits standing on his front porch. Behind them, a news crew was setting up their equipment on the sidewalk. Back at the police department, Officer Clark was being interviewed by the investigators. Unlike Stevens and Hayes, she had nothing to hide, and her account of the booking process was proving invaluable to the investigation. Dr. Johnson's behavior was completely consistent with someone who was exactly who she claimed to be, Clark explained. She was calm, professional, cooperative. She provided all requested information without hesitation. Nothing about her demeanor suggested deception. Harrison nodded, making notes. "And the identification itself? Genuine. Not just genuine, the best security features I've ever seen. The irony is that if Stevens and Hayes had actually been trained properly, they would have recognized Dr. Johnson's work immediately. The license she was carrying incorporated anti-counterfeiting measures she developed herself." "What was your impression of how Stevens and Hayes handled the situation?" Clark hesitated, knowing that her answer would likely end 2 careers. But she also knew that telling the truth was more important than protecting colleagues who had disgraced their badges. "I think they saw a black woman driving through their territory and decided she didn't belong there. Everything that happened after that was just them trying to justify a stop they should never have made in the first place." The investigation was moving quickly now, with more evidence emerging by the hour. Phone records showed that Stevens and Hayes had been in contact with several other officers who had similar patterns of discriminatory arrests. Text messages between the officers revealed a casual attitude toward racial profiling that shocked even seasoned investigators. At the Georgia State Capitol, Governor Richard Coleman was meeting with his senior staff to discuss the political implications of the scandal. Coleman was a pragmatic politician who understood that this incident could either be a disaster for his administration or an opportunity to demonstrate strong leadership on civil rights issues. "Where do we stand legally?" Coleman asked his chief counsel. "The state is in a strong position," replied Attorney Sarah Mitchell. "Dr. Johnson is one of our most valuable employees, and her work has saved the state millions of dollars in fraud prevention. We have every reason to support her fully and use this incident to push for broader reforms." Coleman nodded. "And politically?" His chief of staff, Marcus Thompson, consulted his notes. "The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive of Dr. Johnson. Her story resonates because she represents everything people want to see in public service: competence, integrity, and dedication. The officers, on the other hand, represent everything people hate about bad policing. "I want to meet with Dr. Johnson personally," Coleman decided. "This administration stands behind its people, and I want that message to be crystal clear." 3 days after her arrest, Kiara finally agreed to her first television interview. She sat across from veteran journalist Patricia Williams in a quiet corner of her office at the Department of Driver Services, surrounded by the awards and commendations that told the story of her remarkable career. "Dr. Johnson," Williams began, "I think many people are curious about how someone becomes the person who writes a state's identification policies. Can you tell us about your background?" Kiara smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had shown since the arrest. "It's not the most exciting origin story, I'm afraid. I've always been fascinated by systems, how they work, how they fail, and how they can be improved." She gestured to her bookshelf, which was filled with thick volumes on public policy, statistical analysis, and government operations. "I grew up in a family that believed in public service. My mother was a social worker, my father was a teacher. They taught me that if you see a problem in your community, you don't complain about it, you find a way to fix it." Williams leaned forward, interested. "What drew you specifically to identification and documentation systems?" "Graduate school, actually," Kiara replied. "I was working on my master's degree in public administration at Georgia State, and I chose to write my thesis on identity theft and document fraud. This was back in 2015 when these crimes were exploding, but the technology to prevent them was still primitive." Kiara's expression became more serious as she continued. "What I discovered was horrifying. There were thousands of people in Georgia alone who were victims of identity theft, and many of them were people who could least afford to deal with the consequences. Senior citizens losing their Social Security benefits, single mothers having their benefits cut off, small business owners seeing their credit destroyed. And that's what motivated you to join state government?" "Initially, I was just trying to finish my thesis. But the more research I did, the more I realized that the problem wasn't just the criminals, it was the systems that made their crimes so easy to commit and so hard to detect." Kiara pulled out a folder containing what looked like driver's licenses from different eras. "Look at this," she said, showing Williams a license from 2010. "Basic lamination, simple photograph, easily reproducible security features. A motivated teenager with the right equipment could forge this in an hour." She then produced a current Georgia license. "Now look at this. Holographic security features, microprinting, embedded digital watermarks, RFID chips. The security measures are invisible to casual inspection, but nearly impossible to replicate." "You designed these features?" "My team and I, yes. But it took years of research and testing. We had to balance security with usability, cost with effectiveness. And we had to make sure that legitimate citizens wouldn't be inconvenienced while making life much harder for criminals." Williams studied the license carefully. "This is the same type of license that Officers Stevens and Hayes claimed was fraudulent?" Kiara's smile was rueful. "The irony wasn't lost on me, I assure you. They were looking at identification that incorporated security features I had literally invented, and they declared it fake because it looked too sophisticated." "Take us back to your early days with the Department of Driver Services. What was the situation when you arrived?" Kiara leaned back in her chair, thinking. "Chaos, frankly. Georgia was dealing with hundreds of cases of identity theft every month. Our fraud detection systems were outdated, our training was inadequate, and we were hemorrhaging money to criminals who had figured out how to game our systems." She pulled out a thick report from her desk drawer. "My first assignment was to conduct a comprehensive review of our identification and verification processes. What I found was that we were essentially using 1990s technology to fight 2010's crimes." "What did you recommend?" "Complete overhaul. New technology, new training protocols, new verification procedures. It was a massive undertaking that required coordination between multiple state agencies, law enforcement, and federal authorities." Williams flipped through the report, noting its thoroughness. This must have been expensive. The initial investment was significant, Kiara acknowledged, but the return has been extraordinary. In the 6 years since we implemented the new systems, identity theft related to driver's licenses has decreased by 78%. Document fraud cases have dropped by 85%. We estimate that we've saved the state over $40 million in prevented fraud. And yet 2 police officers couldn't recognize the security features of your own work. Kiara's expression darkened slightly. That points to a larger problem. We can create the most sophisticated security features in the world, but they're useless if the people responsible for recognizing them aren't properly trained. She pulled up a presentation on her computer. Part of my job has been developing training materials for law enforcement. We've created detailed guides, conducted workshops, even developed online training modules. The tools are there, but not everyone uses them. Unfortunately, no. Training requires time, effort, and a commitment to staying current with new developments. Some departments embrace it, others, she shrugged. Williams sensed there was more to this story. Had you encountered problems with the Millbrook Police Department before your arrest? Kiara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Not specifically with Millbrook, but we had received reports about inconsistent enforcement of identification verification procedures in several smaller departments. Some officers seem to be applying different standards based on subjective judgments rather than objective criteria. Subjective judgments? I think we both know what that means, Kiara said quietly. When someone looks at a perfectly valid identification document and declares it fraudulent based on the appearance of the person carrying it, that's not a training issue, that's a bias issue. The interview continued for another hour, with Kiara describing her work on other projects, developing secure voting registration systems, creating fraud-resistant business licensing procedures, and establishing protocols for emergency identification in disaster situations. Dr. Johnson, Williams concluded, what would you say to people who might wonder why someone with your qualifications chooses to work in government rather than the private sector? Kiara considered the question carefully. I could probably make more money working for a technology company or a consulting firm, but I can't think of anything more important than ensuring that the systems our society depends on actually work fairly and effectively for everyone. She gestured toward her office window, which overlooked downtown Atlanta. Every day, millions of Georgians depend on identification systems to access services, prove their identity, protect their rights. When those systems work properly, people don't even think about them. But when they fail, or when they're corrupted by bias or incompetence, the consequences can be devastating. Is that what happened to you? What happened to me was frustrating and embarrassing, but I was fortunate. I had resources, connections, and the knowledge to fight back. But think about all the people who don't have those advantages. Think about all the people who might have been arrested by those same officers, who didn't have the ability to prove their innocence, who just accepted that this was how the system worked. Kiara's voice gained intensity as she continued. That's why this story matters. It's not really about me. It's about all the people who deserve better from the institutions that are supposed to serve them. Word of Kiara's arrest had spread quickly through Atlanta's professional community, particularly among the network of accomplished African-American women who had broken barriers in their respective fields. By the evening of her release, Kiara's phone was buzzing constantly with calls and messages from colleagues, mentors, and friends expressing outrage and support. Dr. Vanessa Roberts, Dean of the School of Public Policy at Georgia State University and Kiara's former professor, was among the first to reach out. Roberts had been following Kiara's career with pride since her graduation, and news of the arrest had left her furious. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes talented people of color question whether public service is worth the hassle, Roberts told a gathering of faculty members the next morning. Here's a woman who has dedicated her career to making government work better for everyone, and she gets treated like a criminal because 2 ignorant officers couldn't recognize excellence when they saw it. The story had also resonated deeply within the broader African American community in Georgia. Reverend James Franklin, pastor of one of Atlanta's most influential churches and a veteran of the civil rights movement, used his Sunday sermon to address the incident. "Brothers and sisters," Franklin told his packed congregation, "what happened to Dr. Johnson could have happened to any of us. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how successful you are, or how much you contribute to your community. In the eyes of some people, all they see is the color of your skin." But Franklin's message wasn't just about the injustice Kiara had experienced. Dr. Johnson's response to this situation is a lesson for all of us. She didn't get angry, she got strategic. She didn't just complain about the system, she used her knowledge and her connections to expose the truth and demand accountability. The business community had also taken notice. Georgia's Black Chamber of Commerce, representing thousands of African-American entrepreneurs and professionals, issued a statement calling for comprehensive police reform and better training on implicit bias. "Dr. Johnson's case illustrates a pattern that affects all of our members," said Chamber President Donald Mitchell. "When law enforcement officers make assumptions based on race rather than evidence, it undermines public safety and economic development. Businesses need to know that their employees and customers will be treated fairly and professionally by police." The story had even caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. The NAACP announced that it was launching a comprehensive investigation into policing practices in smaller Georgia communities, using Kiara's case as a starting point for examining broader patterns of discrimination. Meanwhile, the town of Millbrook was grappling with the unwanted national attention. The community of 15,000 had never been in the spotlight before, and many residents were struggling to understand how their quiet town had become a symbol of police misconduct. At Murphy's Diner, the unofficial gathering place for local politics and gossip, conversations were tense and divided. Some patrons defended Stevens and Hayes, arguing that they were good officers who had made an honest mistake. Others were appalled by what they saw as clear evidence of racial bias. "I've known Luke Stevens for 20 years, said retired factory worker Bill Henderson. "He coached my son's Little League team. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion by outside agitators." But Rita Gonzalez, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, saw things differently. "Bill, you can't ignore the evidence. Those officers had a pattern of targeting people of color. That's not a mistake. That's systematic discrimination." The divide was particularly sharp along racial lines. Millbrook's African-American community, which comprised about 30% of the population, had long complained about disparate treatment by local police. For them, Kiara's arrest was validation of experiences they had been trying to highlight for years. "Finally, people are paying attention," said Deacon Curtis Williams of Mount Olive Baptist Church. "We've been telling anyone who would listen that something was wrong with how certain officers were treating people in our community, but nobody cared until it happened to someone famous." Williams had been documenting incidents for years, collecting sworn statements from community members who felt they had been targeted unfairly by police. His files contained dozens of complaints about unnecessary traffic stops, aggressive questioning, and what witnesses described as obvious racial profiling. "The difference is that Dr. Johnson had the resources and the knowledge to fight back," Williams continued. "Most of the people in our community don't. They just accept that this is how things are and try to avoid any contact with police." The local chapter of the NAACP, led by retired teacher Dorothy Jackson, had been trying to address these issues through proper channels for years. Jackson had requested meetings with Captain Miller, filed formal complaints, and even petitioned the town council for policy changes. Most of her efforts had been politely ignored. "We tried to work within the system," Jackson explained to a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "We documented everything, followed proper procedures, tried to be reasonable, and we got nowhere. It took a nationally embarrassing incident to get anyone to take us seriously." Jackson pulled out a thick folder filled with complaint forms, incident reports, and correspondence with city officials. "Look at this," she said, spreading the documents across her kitchen table. 3 years of documented complaints about aggressive policing in the African American community. 3 years of being told that we're imagining things or being too sensitive. The folder contained disturbing patterns, traffic stops that seemed to occur disproportionately in predominantly black neighborhoods, searches of vehicles and persons that rarely produced evidence of wrongdoing, arrests for minor infractions that typically resulted in dismissed charges. What Dr. Johnson experienced wasn't an isolated incident, Jackson emphasized. It was business as usual for Stevens and Hayes. The only difference was that this time they picked on someone who couldn't be intimidated or silenced. As the investigation expanded, more stories began to emerge. The Atlanta newspapers published a series of articles detailing similar encounters between the two officers and other citizens. A pattern emerged of routine traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, searches conducted on flimsy pretexts, and arrests that were later dismissed when the evidence didn't support the charges. One particularly troubling case involved Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old college student who had been stopped by Stevens and Hayes while driving home from his job at a local restaurant. The officers claimed his temporary registration was fraudulent and arrested him, despite the fact that he had all the proper documentation from the dealership where he had recently purchased the car. Thompson had spent 3 days in jail before a lawyer provided by his family was able to prove that his paperwork was legitimate. The charges were dropped, but Thompson had lost his job because of his absence and had struggled to find new employment due to the arrest on his record. "They treated me like I was some kind of criminal," Thompson told reporters. "I was polite, I complied with everything they asked, but nothing I said mattered. They had already decided I was guilty of something." Similar stories poured in from other community members. Sarah Davis, a nursing student, described being stopped and searched after leaving a study group at the local library. The officers claimed they smelled marijuana in her car, though no drugs were found and Davis had never used illegal substances. "The humiliation was the worst part," Davis explained. "They made me get out of the car on a busy street while they went through all my belongings. People were driving by, watching, assuming I must have done something wrong. The emerging picture was of a systematic campaign of harassment that had been going on for years, targeting primarily young African Americans with tactics designed to intimidate rather than ensure public safety." The Bureau of Investigation, but the Stevens and Hayes case was remarkable for both its scope and its brazenness. The evidence was so overwhelming that Harrison found himself wondering how the officers had gotten away with their behavior for so long. The SBI had established a command center in a conference room at the Millbrook Police Department, much to Captain Miller's discomfort. The room was filled with evidence boxes, computer terminals, and wall charts tracking the timeline of incidents. Harrison stood before a whiteboard covered with photographs, dates, and connecting lines that told the story of 3 years of systematic civil rights violations. Harrison explained to his team, "Isn't just bad policing. It's a deliberate pattern of harassment designed to intimidate and criminalize members of the African American community." The evidence was damning. Analysis of traffic stop data showed that Stevens and Hayes stopped black drivers at a rate nearly 4 times higher than white drivers, despite the fact that searches of black drivers' vehicles produced contraband at a significantly lower rate. "This is classic fishing expedition behavior," noted Agent Lisa Martinez, who specialized in civil rights cases. "They're not stopping people because they suspect criminal activity. They're stopping people hoping to find something they can arrest them for." Even more troubling was the discovery of text messages between the officers that revealed their mindset. Screenshots from Stevens's phone showed conversations with Hayes that were filled with racial slurs and jokes about their arrests. One message chain discussed strategies for justifying searches of vehicles driven by young black men. "We've got reasonable suspicion down to an art form." Stevens had texted Hayes after a particularly productive day. "Nervous behavior, furtive movements, strong odor of air freshener, classic signs of criminal activity. Hayes had responded with a laughing emoji and the comment, "Amazing how many criminals we find when we know what to look for." The investigation had also revealed financial irregularities. Stevens and Hayes had been claiming overtime pay for court appearances in cases that were later dismissed, suggesting they were making arrests they knew wouldn't lead to convictions simply to generate additional income. They were essentially farming arrests, Martinez observed, making money off of harassment disguised as law enforcement. Captain Miller was cooperating fully with the investigation, but Harrison could see the toll it was taking on the man. Miller had built his career on the belief that police work was a noble profession, and discovering that two of his officers had been systematically violating civil rights was devastating to his worldview. "I keep asking myself how I missed this," Miller confided to Harrison during a break in the interviews. "I reviewed their arrest reports. I looked at their statistics. Everything looked normal." Harrison nodded sympathetically. "That's because they were good at covering their tracks. The reports were technically correct. The procedures were followed on paper. The problem was in the motivation behind the stops and the pattern of targeting specific communities." Miller shook his head. "I've got 25 years on this job, and I thought I knew my people. How do you miss something like this?" "Because you were looking for individual bad acts, not systematic patterns," Harrison explained. "This kind of behavior is often invisible until someone takes the time to analyze the data and look for trends." The investigation had expanded beyond Stevens and Hayes to examine the culture of the entire department. While no other officers were found to be engaging in similar behavior, Harrison's team discovered that there had been warning signs that were either missed or ignored. Officer Terrence Davis, one of the few African-American officers in the department, had filed several informal complaints about Stevens and Hayes's behavior. Davis had noticed the patterns in their arrests and had tried to raise concerns with his supervisors, but his complaints had been dismissed as jealousy or personality conflicts. "I tried to tell people what I was seeing," Davis explained during his interview with Harrison. "The way they talked about certain types of people, the way they seemed to enjoy making arrests that didn't lead anywhere, but nobody wanted to hear it." Davis had been particularly troubled by the officers' attitude toward the community they were supposed to serve. They talked about certain neighborhoods like they were enemy territory. They weren't thinking about protecting and serving, they were thinking about controlling and intimidating. The investigation had also revealed that Stevens and Hayes had been receiving commendations for their high arrest rates, which created perverse incentives for their behavior. The department's statistics showed them as productive officers who were actively fighting crime, when in reality they were simply harassing innocent citizens. The system was rewarding exactly the wrong behavior, Harrison noted in his report. These officers were being praised for making arrests, regardless of whether those arrests were justified or led to convictions. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that the case would result in federal charges. The Department of Justice had been monitoring the investigation, and prosecutors were preparing a comprehensive civil rights case that would seek significant prison time for both officers. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had taken a personal interest in the case, seeing it as an opportunity to send a clear message about the consequences of police misconduct. Martinez had built her reputation prosecuting corrupt officials and civil rights violators, and she was known for her thorough preparation and aggressive pursuit of justice. "This case represents everything that's wrong with UNA's biased policing," Martinez told her staff during a strategy meeting. "We have systematic violations of civil rights, abuse of authority, and a complete disregard for the constitutional rights of citizens. We're going to prosecute this to the fullest extent of the law." The charges being prepared were extensive. Stevens and Hayes would face federal civil rights violations, conspiracy charges, and multiple counts of deprivation of rights under color of law. Each count carried significant penalties, and the prosecutors were confident they could prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, the civil attorneys representing Kiara and other victims were preparing their own legal action. The lawsuit would seek damages not just from the individual officers, but from the city of Millbrook and the police department for failing to properly supervise and train their personnel. "This isn't just about compensating the victims," explained attorney Thomas Bradley. "It's about forcing systemic change in how this department operates. We want court-ordered reforms that will prevent this from happening again." The civil case was particularly strong because of the extensive documentation of the officers' patterns. The lawyers had identified at least 30 potential victims whose civil rights had been violated, and they were confident that more would come forward as the case proceeded. The story of Kiara's arrest had taken on a life of its own in the media landscape. What started as a local news story about police misconduct had evolved into a national conversation about racial profiling, police training, and the challenges facing professional African Americans in their interactions with law enforcement. CNN had picked up the story after the initial video went viral, and anchor Anderson Cooper devoted a segment of his primetime show to discussing the case. Cooper interviewed civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who drew parallels between Kiara's experience and broader patterns of discrimination in policing. "What makes Dr. Johnson's case so powerful," Crump explained, "is that it exposes the lie that education and professional success protect you from racial bias. This woman literally wrote the policies these officers were supposed to follow, and they still treated her like a criminal because of the color of her skin." The story had also gained traction on social media, where the hashtag #Justice for Dr. Johnson was trending nationally. The original video of her arrest had been viewed over 5 million times, and thousands of people were sharing their own stories of encounters with biased policing. Twitter user @PolicyExpert23 wrote, "Dr. Johnson's arrest shows that competence and credentials don't matter if you're black." She literally designed the ID system they claimed was fake. Facebook groups dedicated to discussing the case had sprouted up organically, with thousands of members sharing articles, analysis, and personal experiences. The conversation had expanded beyond the specific incident to encompass broader questions about police reform and racial justice. But not all of the attention was supportive. Conservative commentators and some law enforcement organizations had begun pushing back against the narrative, arguing that the officers had been unfairly demonized for making an honest mistake. Fox News host Tucker Carlson devoted a segment to defending Stevens and Hayes, claiming that they were victims of a politically correct witch hunt and that the real problem was a culture that criminalized police work. These officers made a judgment call based on their training and experience, Carlson argued. Now they're being destroyed because they had the misfortune of stopping someone who turned out to be politically connected. Carlson's comments sparked fierce debate online, with critics pointing out that he was ignoring the extensive evidence of the officers' pattern of discriminatory behavior. The backlash was swift and intense, with thousands of people calling attention to the documented evidence of systematic civil rights violations. Police union representatives had also weighed in, though their response was more measured than Carlson's. The Georgia Fraternal Order of Police issued a statement expressing concern about the rush to judgment while acknowledging that the allegations were serious and deserved thorough investigation. "We support good policing and constitutional law enforcement," the statement read. "If these officers violated their oath and the civil rights of citizens, they should be held accountable. But we also caution against painting all law enforcement with the same brush based on the actions of a few individuals." The media attention had been intense for Kiara personally. Reporters had camped outside her apartment building, and she had been forced to take time off work to avoid the constant requests for interviews and statements. Director Washington had assigned security personnel to ensure her safety and privacy. The irony is that I became a public servant because I prefer to work behind the scenes, Chiara told her friend and colleague Dr. Monica Harrison during a quiet dinner at a restaurant outside Atlanta. I never wanted to be the face of a national civil rights case. Harrison, who worked as a policy analyst for the state legislature, had been one of Chiara's strongest supporters throughout the ordeal. Sometimes history chooses you instead of the other way around, she observed. What matters is how you handle it. Chiara stirred her tea thoughtfully. I keep thinking about all the people who've had similar experiences but didn't have the resources or connections to fight back. At least something good might come out of this if it leads to real reforms. The national attention had brought both opportunities and challenges. Chiara had received job offers from major consulting firms, invitations to speak at conferences, and requests to write articles about her experience. But she had also received hate mail and threatening messages from people who saw her as a symbol of everything they opposed. The FBI had recommended that Chiara take precautions for her personal safety, and she had been forced to change her routine and limit her public appearances. The irony of needing protection from the public she served was not lost on her. I went into government to make people's lives better, she confided to Harrison. I never expected that trying to do good work would make me a target. But the support far outweighed the criticism. Chiara's inbox was filled with messages from colleagues, students, and strangers expressing admiration for her grace under pressure and her commitment to justice. Many of the messages came from young African-American professionals who saw her as a role model and inspiration. One particularly moving message came from Jasmine Carter, a recent graduate of Georgia State's public policy program, who had been following Chiara's career for years. Dr. Johnson, your response to this injustice has shown me what it means to turn pain into purpose, Carter wrote. You could have gotten angry and bitter, but instead you're using this experience to fight for change. That's the kind of public servant I want to be. The academic community had also rallied around Chiara. Her alma mater, Emory University, had invited her to deliver the keynote address at their upcoming graduation ceremony. The invitation noted that her commitment to public service and pursuit of justice in the face of adversity embodies the values we hope to instill in our graduates. Professional organizations were taking notice as well. The American Society for Public Administration was preparing to present Chiara with their Award for Excellence in Public Service, recognizing both her policy work and her dignified response to the crisis. Dr. Johnson represents the best of what public service can be, said ASPA President Dr. Robert Kim. Her work has made government more efficient and fair, and her response to this injustice has shown that public servants can be both professional and principled. 6 months after Chiara's arrest, the federal courthouse in Atlanta was packed with spectators, journalists, and law enforcement officials as the trial of Stevens and Hayes began. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had assembled a formidable prosecution team, and they were confident in their case. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. On one side sat Stevens and Hayes with their defense attorneys, looking smaller and more ordinary than they had in their police uniforms. On the other side, the prosecution team had arranged their evidence meticulously: charts, photographs, documents, and computer records that told the story of 3 years of systematic civil rights violations. Judge Patricia Anderson, a Clinton appointee with a reputation for fairness and no tolerance for misconduct, called the court to order. The gallery was filled with members of the African American community from Millbrook, civil rights activists, and reporters from local and national news outlets. Martinez rose to deliver the opening statement, her voice clear and authoritative as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about two police officers who forgot that their job was to protect and serve all citizens equally. Instead, they turned their badges into weapons of intimidation and their authority into a tool for harassment." Martinez walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "Over the next several days, you will hear evidence that Officers Stevens and Hayes systematically targeted African American citizens for traffic stops, searches, and arrests based not on evidence of criminal activity, but on the color of their skin." She opened the folder and pulled out a chart showing arrest statistics. "The numbers don't lie. These officers stopped black drivers at 4 times the rate they stopped white drivers, searched black citizens at 6 times the rate they searched white citizens. And yet, their searches of black citizens produced evidence of wrongdoing at less than half the rate of their searches of white citizens." The chart was displayed on a large screen, visible to the entire courtroom. The disparities were stark and undeniable. "But this case isn't just about statistics," Martinez continued. "It's about real people whose lives were disrupted, whose rights were violated, and whose faith in the justice system was shaken by officers who had sworn to protect them." Martinez gestured toward the gallery, where many of the victims were seated. "You will hear from Marcus Thompson, a college student who was arrested on fraudulent charges and lost his job. You will hear from Sarah Davis, a nursing student who was humiliated by an illegal search. And you will hear from Dr. Kiara Johnson, whose arrest on completely fabricated charges exposed this pattern of abuse." The defense attorney, an experienced criminal lawyer named Robert Clark, had a difficult task ahead of him. The evidence against his clients was overwhelming, and their best hope was to argue that they were following department procedures and had not intended to violate anyone's civil rights. "My clients are not perfect," Clark acknowledged in his opening statement. "They may have made mistakes in judgment, but they are not the racists and criminals the prosecution wants you to believe they are. They were police officers trying to do their job in a difficult and dangerous environment." Clark's strategy was to portray Stevens and Hayes as scapegoats for broader problems in policing, and to argue that their actions, while perhaps inappropriate, did not rise to the level of criminal civil rights violations. "You will hear evidence that these officers were following training they had received, procedures that had been approved by their supervisors, and policies that were in place when they joined the force. They were the products of a system, not rogue actors operating outside the law." But Clark's task was made nearly impossible by the mountain of evidence against his clients. The prosecution had text messages showing clear racial animus, statistical data proving discriminatory enforcement, and victim testimony that would be difficult to explain away. The first witness was Agent Harrison from the SBI, who walked the jury through the investigation that had uncovered the pattern of civil rights violations. Harrison's testimony was methodical and damning, presenting evidence that Stevens and Hayes had systematically targeted minority citizens for harassment. "Our analysis showed that the defendants' traffic stops followed a clear pattern," Harrison explained. "They would focus their enforcement activity on neighborhoods with high minority populations, stop drivers for minor or fabricated violations, and then use those stops as pretexts for searches and arrests." Harrison presented evidence of the officers' text messages, which drew audible gasps from some members of the jury. The messages revealed a casual attitude toward racial profiling that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. In one exchange, Defendant Stevens texted Defendant Hayes about a traffic stop, saying, "Another suspicious character taken off the streets." The person they arrested was later released when the charges were found to be baseless. The prosecution's case was methodical, comprehensive. They called victim after victim to testify about their encounters with Stevens and Hayes, each story adding another layer to the pattern of discrimination and abuse. Marcus Thompson testified about his arrest on fraudulent vehicle registration charges, describing the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his neighbors and the difficulty of finding employment with an arrest record. "They treated me like I was guilty from the moment they stopped me," Thompson said. "Nothing I said mattered. They had already decided I was a criminal." Sarah Davis testified about being searched on a public street based on the officer's claim that they smelled marijuana in her car. No drugs were found, and Davis had never used illegal substances. "The worst part wasn't the search," Davis told the jury. "It was the way they looked at me, like I was something dirty, like I didn't deserve basic respect." When Kiara took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She had been the catalyst for the investigation, and her testimony was crucial to establishing the broader pattern of misconduct. Martinez led Kiara through the events of her arrest, asking her to describe each step of the encounter with Stevens and Hayes. "They declared my identification fraudulent without conducting any meaningful examination," Kiara testified. "When I tried to explain that I worked for the state government and had expertise in identification security, they dismissed me as delusional." "Dr. Johnson?" Martinez asked. "In your professional opinion, did Officers Stevens and Hayes follow proper procedures for verifying identification?" "No, they did not," Kiara replied firmly. "They made no attempt to verify the authenticity of my license through official channels. They relied solely on their subjective assessment, which was both unprofessional and incorrect." Clark tried to challenge Kiara's testimony on cross-examination, suggesting that the officers had reasonable grounds for suspicion and had followed their training. "Dr. Johnson, isn't it possible that officers with years of experience might notice something about your identification that you missed?" Kiara's response was measured but devastating. "Counselor, I designed the security features in that license. I literally wrote the training manual for detecting fraudulent identification in this state. The idea that these officers knew something about document authentication that I didn't is absurd." The defense's case was weak and largely unsuccessful. They called character witnesses for Stevens and Hayes, but their testimony was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of discriminatory behavior. They tried to argue that the officers' actions were consistent with department policies, but Captain Miller testified that targeting citizens based on race was explicitly prohibited. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful and emotional. Martinez stood before the jury and summarized the evidence, emphasizing the human cost of the officers' actions. "This case is about more than two bad police officers," Martinez said. "It's about the promise of equal justice under law, and what happens when that promise is broken by the very people sworn to uphold it." She gestured toward the victims seated in the gallery. Marcus Thompson lost his job because of a false arrest. Sarah Davis was humiliated on a public street. Dr. Johnson was treated like a criminal despite being one of the state's most respected public servants. And they represent just a fraction of the citizens whose rights were violated by these defendants. Martinez's voice rose with passion. "The defendants didn't just break the law, they betrayed their oath, violated their duty, and undermined the very foundation of justice in our society. They must be held accountable." The defense's closing argument was brief and unconvincing. Clark tried to portray his clients as dedicated officers who had made honest mistakes, but the evidence against them was too overwhelming to overcome. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Stevens and Hayes were convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, and multiple counts of false arrest. The maximum sentence for their crimes was 20 years in federal prison. Judge Anderson scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she made her feelings clear in her comments to the defendants. "Your actions were not mistakes or errors in judgment," she told Stevens and Hayes as they stood before her bench. "They were deliberate violations of the constitutional rights of American citizens committed by people who had sworn to protect those very rights." The sentencing hearing drew even larger crowds than the trial. Judge Anderson's courtroom was packed with victims, community leaders, civil rights activists, and journalists who had been following the case from the beginning. Stevens received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, while Hayes received 10 years. The sentences were longer than many had expected, but Judge Anderson explained her reasoning in detail. These defendants used their positions of authority to systematically terrorize members of the African American community, Anderson said. They turned law enforcement into a tool of oppression rather than protection. Such conduct strikes at the very heart of our constitutional system and demands severe punishment. The civil lawsuit had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but sources familiar with the negotiations suggested that the city of Millbrook had paid several $1,000,000 to compensate the victims. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for comprehensive police reform, including mandatory bias training, enhanced supervision, and regular audits of arrest patterns. Kiara had used her portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund for African American students pursuing careers in public service. The Dr. Kiara Johnson Scholarship would provide full tuition support for students committed to working in government and making positive changes in their communities. "I don't want any student to be discouraged from public service because of what happened to me," Kiara explained at the scholarship announcement. "We need talented people of all backgrounds working to make government more effective and more fair." The case had also led to significant policy changes at the state level. Governor Coleman had appointed Kiara to lead a comprehensive review of police training standards with a focus on identification, verification procedures, and bias recognition. Dr. Johnson's expertise and her experience give her unique qualifications to lead this effort, Coleman said at the announcement ceremony. "We're going to make sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else in Georgia." The reforms Kiara developed were comprehensive and far-reaching. They included mandatory training on the latest identification security features, regular testing of officers' ability to recognize authentic documents, and strict accountability measures for departments with suspicious arrest patterns. "The goal isn't just to prevent false arrests," Kiara explained in her report to the governor. "It's to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. When citizens know that police officers are properly trained and held accountable, everyone is safer." The Millbrook Police Department had undergone a complete transformation under Captain Miller's leadership. Miller had survived the scandal by demonstrating his commitment to reform and his willingness to acknowledge past failures. "We failed our community," Miller admitted at a town hall meeting 6 months after the trial. "But we're not going to let that failure define us. We're going to build something better." The department had hired Officer Terrence Davis as its new training coordinator. Recognizing his efforts to expose the misconduct, Davis had developed new protocols for community engagement and had worked to rebuild trust between police and residents. "It's going to take time," Davis acknowledged. "But we're seeing progress. People are starting to believe that we're serious about change." The case had also had national implications. The Department of Justice had used the Millbrook investigation as a model for examining police practices in other communities, leading to federal oversight agreements in several cities with similar problems. Kiara had become a sought-after speaker on issues of police reform and government accountability. She had testified before Congress about the need for better training and oversight, and her recommendations had influenced federal legislation on law enforcement practices. The system worked in my case because I had resources and knowledge, Chiara told a congressional committee. But the system should work for everyone, regardless of their education or connections. That's what real justice looks like. Her work had earned recognition from across the political spectrum. Conservative lawmakers praised her focus on effective training and accountability, while progressives appreciated her commitment to civil rights and community safety. 2 years after her arrest, Chiara was promoted to Deputy Director of the Department of Driver Services, giving her broader authority to implement reforms across the state. Her first major initiative was the creation of a civilian oversight board to monitor police use of identification verification powers. Trust is earned through transparency and accountability, Chiara said at the oversight board's first meeting. We're going to make sure that every citizen knows their rights are protected. The board included community leaders, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement representatives, creating a forum for ongoing dialogue about police practices and community concerns. Early reports showed significant improvements in police-community relations in departments that had embraced the new training and oversight measures. Stevens and Hayes had begun serving their sentences at a federal prison in South Carolina. Both men had lost their law enforcement certifications and would be prohibited from working in policing after their release. Their cases had become cautionary tales taught in police academies across the country. The broader community of Millbrook had also changed. The town had elected its first African-American mayor, Dorothy Jackson, the former NAACP leader who had documented police misconduct for years. Jackson's platform focused on healing and unity, but she also emphasized the need for continued vigilance. We can't let our guard down just because 2 bad officers are in prison, Jackson said in her inaugural address. Real change requires constant effort and attention. We have to stay committed to the work of building a just community. Chiara had maintained a relatively low profile since her promotion, preferring to focus on her policy work rather than media attention, but she occasionally spoke publicly about her experience and its aftermath. What happened to me was wrong, but it led to changes that will benefit thousands of people, she reflected during a speech at her alma mater, Emory University. Sometimes injustice becomes the catalyst for justice, but only if people are willing to fight for what's right. She had also become a mentor to young professionals, particularly African Americans considering careers in public service. Her office was regularly visited by students and recent graduates seeking advice about navigating the challenges of government work. Don't let fear keep you from serving, she would tell them. The system needs people who are committed to making it better. Yes, you might face obstacles and injustices, but that's exactly why your voice matters. The scholarship program Chiara had established was thriving, with its first recipients beginning their careers in various government agencies across Georgia. The scholars were required to commit to at least 5 years of public service, ensuring that Chiara's investment would have lasting impact. Marcus Thompson, the college student who had been arrested by Stevens and Hayes, was among the scholarship recipients. He had changed his major to public administration after following Chiara's case, determined to work for criminal justice reform. Dr. Johnson showed me that you can turn something negative into something positive, Thompson said. She didn't just fight for herself, she fought for all of us. As the 3rd anniversary of her arrest approached, Chiara was invited to return to Millbrook for a community celebration recognizing the progress that had been made. The event was held at the same intersection where she had been pulled over, now designated as Justice Square in recognition of the changes that had followed. 3 years ago, this spot represented everything that was wrong with our community, Mayor Jackson told the gathered crowd. Today, it represents our commitment to doing better. Kiara's remarks were brief but powerful. She spoke about the importance of turning personal pain into public purpose and the responsibility that all citizens have to hold their institutions accountable. Change doesn't happen automatically, she said. It requires people who are willing to stand up, speak out, and do the hard work of making things better. Each of you has that power and that responsibility. The crowd included many of the people who had supported her during the crisis, as well as some who had initially been skeptical of her claims. The transformation of the community was evident in their presence together, united in their commitment to justice and equality. As the ceremony concluded, Kiara stood quietly for a moment at the spot where she had been arrested 3 years earlier. The intersection looked the same, but everything else had changed. The community was different, the police department was different, and she was different too. She thought about the young woman who had been handcuffed at this spot, facing an uncertain future and an unjust system. That woman had been angry and scared, but she had also been determined to fight for what was right. The fight wasn't over, it never really island. But significant progress had been made, lives had been changed, and systems had been reformed. Justice had been served, not just in the courtroom but in the broader work of building a more fair and equitable society. Kiara walked back to her car, the same silver sedan she had been driving that day 3 years earlier. As she drove away from Millbrook, she felt a sense of satisfaction that came not from revenge or vindication, but from the knowledge that her experience had made things better for others. The road ahead stretched out before her, filled with new challenges and opportunities to serve. But she was ready for whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that justice, though sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails when good people refuse to give up the fight. Kiara Johnson had become more than just an account of injustice overcome. It had become a reminder that individuals can make a difference, that systems can be changed, and that the arc of the moral universe, though long, does indeed bend toward justice when people are willing to grab hold of it and pull.